Billionaire pays her debt for a baby, but after taking her virginity, he falls in love and won't let her go. Welcome, dear viewers. I am your storyteller, James. First, I want to give a special thanks to all of you for the incredible support and love you showed for the last story. Your comments, likes, and shares truly mean the world to me. It motivates me to keep creating and delivering heartfelt content for you. I see you, I hear you, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of you who takes the time to engage with this channel. Before we begin, let me offer you a heartfelt prayer. May peace fill your heart and mind. May your days be touched with joy, and your nights be filled with rest. May you find strength in difficult moments, and may love and kindness surround you always. May every door you seek to open be unlocked, and may happiness follow you wherever you go. Now, I've noticed that many of you are watching and listening to the stories, but haven't subscribed yet. I know it's a challenge to keep up with the constant stream of content online, but I'm trying my very best to meet your standards and give you stories that touch your heart and soul. Your support means everything to me, and subscribing helps this channel grow so I can continue creating meaningful content for you. If you enjoy these stories, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button, give it a like, and share it with someone who needs a little inspiration today. My request to you today is simple. Please stay with me until the end. Don't skip through. This story will touch your soul, and I promise it will be worth your time. So sit back, relax, and let me take you on an emotional journey you won't forget. Let's begin the story. Sandy sat on the edge of her small, worn-out bed, her wide, beautiful brown eyes fixed on the pile of bills scattered across the table like shattered pieces of her life. Her chest tightened painfully as she traced the creases in the papers with trembling fingers. Her mother's medical bills had become a monster, swallowing her whole, suffocating her with the weight of endless zeros and angry red notices stamped across each envelope. The hospital had already threatened to cut off treatment unless the payments were made soon. Her mother's fragile body lay in that cold, sterile room, hooked up to machines keeping her alive, and Sandy felt like she was drowning in quicksand, sinking deeper with every passing second. She had tried everything, working overtime at the small diner, cutting down on food to save money, even borrowing from friends. But nothing was enough. The creditors were relentless, circling her like hungry wolves, calling day and night with cold, unforgiving voices demanding payment. She could feel the walls closing in, the weight of hopelessness crushing her chest until it was hard to breathe. Tears burned at the back of her eyes as she pressed her face into her hands, her slender shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She was losing everything: her home, her peace of mind, her mother's chance at survival, and there was nothing left for her to give until he appeared. Mark Wood. The name alone was enough to make people's blood run cold. He was ruthless, calculating, a billionaire tycoon with a reputation for breaking competitors without mercy and getting what he wanted at any cost. He was the definition of power and danger, wrapped in tailored suits and cold blue eyes. Sandy had only seen him from a distance once, walking through the city in his crisp Armani suit, his dark hair falling perfectly across his forehead, his sharp jawline framed by a meticulously groomed beard that seemed to enhance the coldness of his expression. He looked untouchable, like a king walking among peasants. And now that king was standing before her, his tall, powerful frame filling the room with a suffocating presence. Sandy had been called to his penthouse under mysterious circumstances, her heart thudding wildly in her chest as she stepped through the polished glass doors into a world of gleaming marble, breathtaking views, and an unmistakable aura of wealth and control. Mark sat behind a massive glass desk, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin as he studied her with a gaze so intense it made her skin flush. His eyes traced over her brown skin, the way her curves were hugged by her simple black dress, and Sandy's stomach tightened under the weight of that attention. She could barely hold his gaze as he stood, walking toward her with the predatory grace of a panther, his cologne a dark mix of musk and spice that made her dizzy. He stopped inches from her, his gaze drilling into her soul as his voice, low, deep, and dangerously smooth, cut through the tension like a blade. "I hear you're in trouble," he said, his mouth curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sandy's mouth went dry as he leaned closer. "Your mother's medical bills, the debt. I can make it all go away." Sandy's breath hitched, her heart hammered painfully in her chest as she stared at him, unsure if she had misheard. "What? What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her ears. Mark's hand brushed against her arm, his touch so light and deliberate it sent a jolt of heat through her veins. "I'll pay everything," he said, his gaze darkening as he tilted her chin up with a single finger. "Every last cent. You'll never have to worry about money again." Sandy's lips parted, hope warring with disbelief and confusion. "Why?" she whispered, her wide eyes searching his face. Mark's smile sharpened, his gaze turning predatory. "Because I want something in return," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I want you to give me a baby." Sandy's body locked up, her breath stalling in her throat as the weight of his words slammed into her. "A baby?" She took a shaky step back, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. This had to be a sick joke. But Mark's expression remained cold and serious, the dark glint in his eyes telling her he was not playing games. "Well, why?" she stammered, her voice breaking. Mark's eyes narrowed. "I need an heir, and I want you to give it to me." His hand brushed a stray braid from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the ruthlessness in his gaze. "You're beautiful, Sandy," he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "Strong, smart, perfect." Sandy's heart hammered painfully as her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet remained frozen. Her mother's face flashed in her mind, pale and weak in that hospital bed. She thought of the endless phone calls from creditors, the notices piling up, the looming threat of losing her mother forever. Sandy's throat tightened as Mark's hand slid down her arm, his touch leaving a trail of heat in its wake. "It's just a business deal," he said, his lips curving into a cold smile. "You give me what I want and I'll give you what you need." Sandy's chest heaved, her breath shallow and ragged. "And if I say no?" Mark's smile faded, his gaze hardening into steel. "Then you'll lose everything." His voice was soft but lethal, a promise wrapped in velvet. Sandy's knees threatened to give out. She was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into a dark abyss. Her soul screamed that this was wrong, that giving herself to him like this was dangerous. But the alternative was losing her mother. Slowly, shakily, Sandy forced herself to look into Mark's eyes. "And after?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "After the baby?" Mark's gaze flicked over her face, unreadable. "After the baby, the contract ends," he said, his voice cold and detached. "We walk away." Sandy's heart twisted painfully. A business arrangement, nothing more. But the fire in Mark's eyes told her there was something darker beneath the surface, something possessive, something dangerous. She took a shaky breath, knowing this was madness. But what choice did she have? Slowly, painfully, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. Mark's lips curved into a dangerous smile. "Good girl," he murmured, his hand brushing over her braid before he leaned down and kissed her cheek. Sandy's knees threatened to buckle as the heat from his breath melted down her skin. She had just signed her soul away to the devil, and now there was no turning back. Sandy stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Mark's penthouse, the glittering city lights stretching endlessly below, as if they were stars scattered beneath her feet. The night was cold and quiet, the soft hum of the city distant and muted, but her heart hammered so loudly in her chest that it drowned out every sound. Her brown skin glowed under the soft golden light of the penthouse, her delicate fingers clasped tightly together as the coolness of the glass pressed against her palm. The luxurious room behind her was a masterpiece of wealth and power. Black marble floors, minimalist gray furnishings, and abstract paintings that screamed exclusivity. But none of that could stop the ice-cold fear tightening her chest as Mark Wood stood just feet away, his tall, powerful figure cutting through the polished room like a shadow. He was watching her with those piercing blue eyes, his sharp jawline framed by a perfectly trimmed beard that made him look like a dark king surveying his kingdom. His black suit was fitted flawlessly to his body, every line and crease emphasizing the strength beneath the fabric. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand, the amber liquid swirling slowly as his gaze remained locked on Sandy. Slowly, he stepped toward her, his leather shoes making a soft, deadly sound against the marble floor. Sandy's breath hitched as he stopped inches from her, the heat of his body brushing against her trembling skin. His cologne, dark spice and musk, wrapped around her, making her lightheaded. He set the whiskey glass down on a small side table, his long fingers trailing over the glass rim before turning his attention fully toward her. "I've had my lawyers draft the terms," Mark said, his deep, velvety voice sliding over her like silk. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black folder, placing it on the glass table between them. Sandy's eyes locked on the folder as though it were a ticking bomb. Her stomach knotted painfully, her knees weak beneath her. Mark's gaze sharpened as he watched her reaction. He stepped around the table, his powerful frame looming over her as he opened the folder and slid the contract toward her. "All you have to do," Mark said softly, "is sign." Sandy's eyes darted across the long sheets of paper, the crispness of the contract mocking her trembling hands. Black ink spread across the stark white paper, detailing every term in cold, lifeless words. She would bear Mark Wood's child in exchange for the complete settlement of all her debts. Once the child was born, the contract would be fulfilled. Sandy's heart thudded painfully as her breath caught in her throat. She traced the hard lines of the contract with her eyes, the enormity of the decision crushing her chest. "Once you're pregnant, the debt is gone." Mark's voice was low and commanding, pulling her focus back to him. Sandy's gaze lifted, her eyes locking with his. His expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity beneath the cold exterior, a spark of something deeper, something dangerous. Sandy's hands shook as she reached for the pen lying beside the contract. Mark's hand shot out, his long fingers curling over hers as his thumb brushed against the softness of her skin. Sandy inhaled sharply, the contact sending a rush of heat through her veins. "Are you sure?" Mark asked, his voice low and dangerous. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face, his thumb tracing over her knuckles in a slow, almost possessive motion. Sandy's lips parted, but no words came out. Was she sure? Her mother's face flashed in her mind, the tired eyes, the fragile frame lying in that hospital bed, the crushing weight of the medical bills sitting on her kitchen table, the cold threat of losing everything. She had no choice. Slowly, Sandy nodded, her eyes glistening with a thin sheen of tears. "Yes," she whispered. Mark's eyes darkened. Without breaking eye contact, he released her hand and leaned back, his gaze sharp and calculating as he watched her lift the pen. Sandy's hand hovered over the contract, the pen trembling between her fingers. Her heart was a wild drumbeat in her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. She could feel Mark's gaze burning into her, heavy, consuming. She pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and scrawled her name in slow, shaky strokes. Sandy Brooks. Her signature looked too small, too fragile beneath the cold weight of the contract's words. When she finished, Mark's hand slid across the table and picked up the contract. His fingers lingered on the paper, his gaze flicking over her signature before a dangerous smile curved his lips. "Good girl," he murmured, his voice low and rough. He closed the folder and set it aside, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's done." Sandy's breath hitched. The room suddenly felt too hot, the weight of what she had just agreed to crashing down on her like a tidal wave. She had signed away her body, her future, everything, to a man known for his ruthlessness and control. Mark's hand brushed over her arm, the contact so light it made her skin shiver. "We'll begin soon," he said, his voice dangerously soft. His thumb brushed down her bare arm, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. Sandy's body locked up at the suggestion, heat coiling low in her belly despite the fear twisting her insides. Mark's gaze sharpened as he watched her reaction, his mouth curving into a slow, predatory smile. "You're trembling," he observed, his voice low and dark. "Are you afraid of me?" Sandy's eyes widened. "No," she whispered, but the word was shaky, uncertain. Mark's smile deepened. "Good," he murmured, his hand sliding up her arm until his fingers brushed over the curve of her neck. Sandy's breath stilled as his thumb traced the soft skin beneath her jaw. His gaze dropped to her parted lips, his eyes darkening with hunger. "You're mine now, Sandy," he said softly, his breath brushing against her lips. "And I take care of what's mine." A shiver ran through her body as Mark leaned in closer, his mouth brushing the corner of her mouth before he pulled back. His gaze was a storm of heat and possession. Sandy's chest heaved as he released her and took a step back. "Rest tonight," he said smoothly. "We'll begin soon." His gaze flicked over her one last time before he turned and walked toward the large glass windows. His tall, powerful frame cut an imposing figure against the glittering city lights, and Sandy's breath faltered as she watched him. He had just bought her future and her body, and somehow the most terrifying part wasn't the contract itself. It was the dark, dangerous spark in Mark's eyes when he had told her that she was his. Sandy's knees weakened beneath her as the truth sank in. She had just sold herself to the devil. And the most terrifying part? She wasn't sure she wanted to be saved. Mark's hand curled around Sandy's delicate fingers as he led her down the long marble hallway of his penthouse, his grip steady and sure. Sandy's heart hammered wildly in her chest, her pulse echoing in her ears as the soft click of Mark's expensive leather shoes against the floor seemed to match the wild rhythm of her heartbeat. The penthouse was quiet except for the distant hum of the city below, the golden glow from the modern wall sconces casting a soft haze over the sleek, black and white decor. Sandy's bare shoulders prickled with heat beneath the thin straps of her dress, her brown skin shimmering beneath the soft lighting as Mark's tall, powerful frame moved ahead of her with silent confidence. Her throat was dry, her hands clammy, but she didn't pull away. Not when Mark's long fingers curled more firmly around hers, not when he opened the door to his bedroom and gently pulled her inside. The room was massive, the floor-to-ceiling windows exposing the city skyline, glittering beneath a velvet sky. A massive king-size bed with black silk sheets stood at the center of the room, the low lights from the bedside lamps casting seductive shadows across the space. Mark stopped in front of the bed and turned toward her, his blue eyes piercing through the dim light, dark with an intensity that made Sandy's breath hitch painfully in her throat. He didn't say a word. He simply reached for her, his large hands sliding over her bare arms, his touch warm and controlled. Sandy's eyes widened as Mark's hands trailed up to her shoulders, his fingers brushing over the thin straps of her dress. He watched her carefully, his sharp jawline tightening as his fingers slid beneath the delicate fabric. Her breath caught as he slowly pushed the straps down, the dress slipping lower, exposing the smooth curve of her collarbone and the swell of her breasts beneath the thin lace of her bra. Mark's eyes darkened as the dress pooled at her feet, leaving her nearly bare before him. His gaze traced over the soft curves of her waist, the delicate slope of her hips, and the smooth expanse of her brown skin, glistening under the low light. "You're stunning," Mark murmured, his voice rough with hunger. His hand lifted, his thumb brushing along her jawline before he cupped her face. His lips parted as his gaze swept over her flushed cheeks and the slight tremor in her breath. "Have you ever done this before?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Sandy's lips parted, her breath shaky. She hesitated, her wide brown eyes glimmering with uncertainty. Slowly, she shook her head. Mark's entire body tensed, his hand stilled against her cheek as his gaze sharpened dangerously. "Never?" he pressed, his thumb brushing along her lower lip. Sandy's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths as she shook her head again. "No," she whispered. Mark's eyes darkened, his jaw flexing as something primal and possessive flared beneath his sharp features. His hand slid down to her bare shoulder, his thumb pressing into her smooth skin as his gaze scorched over her like fire. "You're a virgin," he breathed, almost to himself. Sandy's cheeks burned as she nodded, her gaze dropping. But Mark's hand tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. There was something raw and dangerous in his expression now, a dark hunger that seemed to coil through his entire body. His lips parted, his breath shallow as his gaze locked on hers. "You've saved yourself." His voice was rough, barely a whisper. Sandy's pulse skittered wildly as his thumb brushed over the softness of her lower lip. "For me?" Sandy's breath faltered. Her chest squeezed painfully beneath the weight of his gaze, but she couldn't look away. Mark's hand slid down her bare arm, his fingers wrapping around her wrist as he pulled her closer. "You're mine," he murmured, his breath brushing over her lips. "Only mine." Sandy's pulse shattered as Mark's mouth descended on hers, his lips fierce and demanding as he kissed her deeply. His hand slid into her braided hair, tugging her head back as his tongue swept into her mouth, claiming her with ruthless precision. Sandy's body melted beneath him as his arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her against his chest as his mouth devoured hers. His hand slid down her back, his palm splaying over the curve of her hip as he lowered her onto the bed. His mouth left hers only long enough to trail down her neck, his teeth grazing over her sensitive skin. Sandy's back arched as his mouth found the hollow of her throat, his hand sliding beneath the thin lace of her bra. Her breath hitched when his fingers found her bare skin, his touch sending a wildfire through her veins. "You're perfect," Mark whispered, his mouth brushing over her ear as he pulled her bra down, exposing the softness of her skin. His mouth trailed lower, his lips finding the swell of her breast as his hand slid over her hip, guiding her thighs apart beneath him. Sandy's breath came in short, desperate gasps as Mark's mouth moved over her skin, his hands exploring every inch of her with reverent hunger. "Relax," he whispered against her skin, his breath hot and dangerous. His hand slid between her thighs, teasing her, coaxing her body to open beneath him. Sandy's hands curled into the silk sheets as her head fell back, her breath dissolving into soft whimpers. Mark's eyes darkened at the sound, his mouth curving into a dangerous smile. "That's it," he murmured, his voice like silk. "Let me hear you." His hand slipped higher, and Sandy's entire body arched beneath him as pleasure ignited through her veins. Her breath hitched as Mark's mouth captured hers again, his kiss hard and consuming. His body pressed into hers, his weight sinking against her as he positioned himself between her thighs. His eyes blazed as he pulled back just enough to look at her. "You're mine now," he whispered, his gaze dark and dangerous. Sandy's breath trembled as Mark's hand slid over her thigh, guiding her closer. Her body trembled beneath him, her heart pounding wildly as he leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers. "I'll take care of you," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Forever." Then he pushed into her with one swift stroke, tearing a soft cry from Sandy's lips as her body opened beneath him. Mark's breath hitched, his eyes flashing with fierce hunger as he stilled, his hands tightening around her hips. "Sandy," he breathed, his voice strained. Sandy's nails dug into his back as Mark began to move, his rhythm slow and controlled at first, but when her soft moans filled the room, something dark and possessive shattered inside him. His pace quickened, his grip tightening as he drove into her with fierce, desperate hunger. Sandy's head fell back as pleasure exploded through her body, her soft cries filling the room. Mark's hand slid into her hair as his mouth found hers again, his kiss rough and claiming. "You're mine," he growled against her lips. "Forever." His body shuddered as he reached his release, his hand curling around the back of her neck as he pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "Mine," he repeated, his breath ragged. Sandy's chest heaved as Mark pulled her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. His lips brushed over her hair as his hand slid down her back, holding her close. Sandy's breath trembled as Mark's arms tightened around her, his possessive grip telling her that this wasn't just a contract anymore. It was something more, something deeper. Mark Wood had just claimed her, and Sandy knew she would never be the same again. From the moment the sun rose after that night, Mark Wood was a changed man. Sandy awoke to find him still in bed beside her, his strong arm possessively draped over her waist, his face buried in the curve of her neck as if he couldn't bear to let her go. His hand slid along the smooth slope of her hip, his breath warm against her skin as he stirred awake. But it wasn't just that morning, it was every morning after. Mark's obsession with Sandy began to grow with a dangerous intensity, as if taking her virginity had unlocked something dark and primal inside him. He started finding reasons to touch her, brushing his fingers along the curve of her back when he walked past her, pulling her hand into his lap when they sat together, tucking her braided hair behind her ear just so he could trace the line of her jaw with his thumb. Sandy would catch him watching her across the room, his blue eyes dark with hunger, his sharp jawline tightening every time another man so much as looked at her. He began showering her with gifts, fresh bouquets of red roses that appeared every morning in the penthouse, delicate diamond necklaces and pearl earrings laid out on her vanity, silk dresses and designer shoes delivered in boxes wrapped with gold ribbon. But it wasn't the expensive gifts that made Sandy's heart pound. It was the way Mark looked at her when he gave them to her. His gaze would burn into hers, his hand brushing over her cheek as he whispered, "You're mine, Sandy." The words sent shivers down her spine every time. One evening, Sandy sat on the balcony of the penthouse, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she stared out over the city lights. Mark appeared behind her, his large frame casting a shadow as he knelt beside her chair and slipped a velvet box into her lap. Sandy's fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing a delicate diamond bracelet that sparkled beneath the moonlight. "Mark, this is too much," she breathed, her wide brown eyes lifting to his face. But Mark's hand curled around her wrist, his thumb brushing over her pulse. "It's not enough," he said darkly, his eyes glinting with possessive fire. "Nothing I give you will ever be enough. But you'll take it because you belong to me now." His mouth brushed over the side of her neck, and Sandy's breath hitched as his hand slid over her bare thigh beneath the thin silk of her dress. "Mark." Her voice trembled, but he turned her face toward him, his lips capturing hers in a slow, devouring kiss that left her breathless. Sandy's chest ached with confusion and longing. She wasn't sure what was happening between them anymore. The contract had been simple: give him a child and her debt would be gone. But this felt like something else entirely. The way Mark touched her, the way he looked at her, the way he couldn't seem to stand being away from her for more than a few hours. It wasn't just a transaction anymore. It was need. It was hunger. It was dangerous. One afternoon, Sandy left the penthouse to visit her mother at the hospital. She thought she had slipped out unnoticed, but when she returned, Mark was waiting for her by the elevator. His blue eyes were ice cold, his mouth pressed into a hard line as he stepped toward her, his broad chest blocking her path. "Where were you?" His voice was low and dangerous, sending a chill down her spine. I went to see my mother," Sandy stammered, her hands trembling at her sides. Mark's jaw flexed as his hand wrapped around her wrist. "Without telling me?" His eyes darkened, his grip tightening. "You don't leave without telling me where you're going, Sandy. Ever." Sandy's eyes widened. "I didn't think I needed your permission." Mark's eyes blazed dangerously as he pulled her flush against his chest. "You do," he growled. "You're mine now, Sandy. You don't walk away from me." His mouth descended on hers, rough and claiming as his hand tangled in her braids, tilting her head back until she gasped against his lips. He kissed her like he was punishing her, his hand splaying across the small of her back as he pressed her against the hard length of his body. When he pulled back, his gaze burned into hers. "Do you understand me?" Sandy's breath came in shallow gasps as Mark's hand slid down to her waist, possessively gripping her hip. "Yes," she whispered, her voice unsteady. Mark's eyes softened slightly, but the hunger didn't fade. He lifted her into his arms and carried her toward the bedroom, his mouth brushing over her ear as he whispered, "Good girl." The next morning, Sandy woke to find another box on the nightstand, this time a necklace with a diamond pendant in the shape of a heart. Mark slid his arm around her waist as she sat up, pressing a kiss to her bare shoulder. "Wear it for me," he murmured, fastening the necklace around her neck. Sandy's heart pounded as his hand slid beneath the sheets, his fingers trailing over the bare curve of her hip. "You look perfect," Mark whispered, his mouth finding hers. Every day after that, Mark's obsession only grew. He began rearranging his schedule so he could spend more time with her, taking her to exclusive restaurants and high-end boutiques. But it was more than just the outings. It was the way he never took his eyes off her, the way his hand never left her lower back, the way he kissed her like he couldn't breathe without her. But the intensity of his attention began to overwhelm her. One evening, Sandy stood in the massive walk-in closet Mark had filled with designer clothes, her hands shaking as she stared at the rows of silk dresses and diamond jewelry. This wasn't her life. This was Mark's world, and she wasn't sure how she fit into it. That night at dinner, she pushed her plate away and looked up at Mark with hesitant eyes. "Maybe I should go back to my apartment," she whispered. Mark's gaze sharpened, his hand tightening around his glass of whiskey. "Why?" Sandy's chest tightened. "Because this isn't real. You don't have to keep pretending, Mark. The contract—" "To hell with the contract." Mark's voice sliced through the air as he slammed the glass down on the table. He rose from his chair, his gaze burning into hers as he stalked toward her. His hand curled around the back of her neck as he leaned down, his mouth hovering over hers. "Do you really think this is about a contract anymore?" Sandy's breath hitched as his hand slid over her jaw, his thumb brushing over her parted lips. "You think I'm spending every waking moment thinking about you because of some damn contract?" His mouth brushed over hers, his breath hot and ragged. "You belong to me, Sandy. I don't care about the contract anymore. I care about you." Sandy's heart raced as Mark's arms wrapped around her, lifting her against his chest. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, his mouth capturing hers in a searing kiss. Sandy's hands slid into his hair as Mark carried her toward the bedroom, his kiss rough and claiming. When he laid her down on the bed, his hands sliding beneath the silk of her dress, his gaze darkened with dangerous hunger. "Mine," he whispered against her skin, Forever. Sandy's breath trembled as Mark's mouth moved lower, his body sinking into hers as his hands explored her curves. As Mark's mouth captured hers again, Sandy realized with a shiver that Mark Wood wasn't just obsessed with her, he was in love with her. And there was no turning back. Sandy's heart was racing as she stood at the window of Mark's massive penthouse, the city lights glittering beneath the dark night sky. Her hands trembled against the cool glass, her breath shallow as the weight of her emotions pressed down on her chest. It had been weeks since that first night, weeks since Mark had taken her with a passion that still made her skin burn at the memory. But the contract that bound them together was starting to feel less like a business arrangement and more like a dangerous trap. Mark had stopped following the rules. He had stopped treating her like a temporary arrangement. And that terrified her. Tonight had been no different. He had taken her to one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, a place where the waiters bowed and whispered Mark's name with reverence, where the other guests stared at her in admiration and envy. Mark had sat beside her at the table, his hand resting possessively on her thigh beneath the tablecloth, his thumb brushing slow, lazy circles against her skin as he watched her with those dark, piercing eyes. Every time Sandy had tried to speak, Mark had leaned closer, his mouth brushing against her ear as he whispered, "Eat, Sandy." His low voice had sent shivers down her spine, making it hard to focus on anything other than the way his hand kept creeping higher beneath her dress. And then, after dinner, he had taken her hand and led her to his private car, pulling her onto his lap the moment the door closed. Now, Sandy felt her chest tightening as she heard the soft sound of Mark's footsteps behind her. She knew he was there before he even touched her. His presence was like heat in the room, filling every corner until there was no space left to breathe. His large hand slid over her waist, his breath warm against the side of her neck, as his mouth brushed over her ear. "Why are you shaking?" he murmured. Sandy closed her eyes as his hands slid lower, his thumbs grazing the bare skin beneath the thin silk of her dress. "I'm not," she whispered, but Mark's grip tightened, pulling her back against his hard chest. "You're lying." His lips pressed against the curve of her neck, and Sandy's body melted despite herself. "Talk to me," Mark demanded, his voice dark and low. "Tell me what's going on in that beautiful head of yours." Sandy's hands curled into fists as tears burned behind her eyes. Her breath hitched when Mark turned her around, his hands gripping her hips as he pulled her closer. His blue eyes were sharp and dark as they searched her face. "Why are you holding back from me?" he asked quietly, his tone dangerous but gentle at the same time. Sandy's lip trembled as her hands flattened against his chest. "Because this wasn't supposed to be real." Mark's gaze darkened instantly. His hand slid up her back, threading through her braided hair as he tilted her head back. "What wasn't supposed to be real?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Sandy's chest ached as tears filled her eyes. "Us," she whispered. "This was supposed to be a deal. I was supposed to give you a baby, and then I was supposed to walk away." Mark's expression twisted into something dark and dangerous. His hands curled possessively around her waist, dragging her flush against his body until her soft curves pressed against his hard chest. "And you think you can just walk away now?" His mouth hovered over hers, his breath ragged and hot. "You think I'm going to let you go?" Sandy's hands pushed weakly against his chest, but Mark's grip tightened, his mouth brushing over her jaw as his breath trembled against her skin. "You stopped being a deal the moment I touched you," he growled. "Do you understand me, Sandy? The moment I took you, when I felt how untouched you were, that's when everything changed." Sandy's heart slammed painfully against her ribs. "Mark, please." "Please what?" Mark's hand slid down her back, gripping her hip tightly as his mouth pressed against the side of her neck. "Do you want me to let you go? Say the word and I'll stop." "But you won't say it." Sandy's breath broke as tears slipped down her cheeks. "I'm scared," she whispered, Of what? Mark's voice softened, but his hands remained firm on her hips. Sandy's eyes glistened as she looked up at him. Of feeling this way, of falling for you when this was never supposed to be real. Mark's eyes sharpened with a dangerous gleam. He brushed her tears away with his thumb, his hand cupping the side of her face. It's real now, he said roughly. You think I would have let you into my bed, into my life, if it wasn't real? Sandy's breath hitched when Mark's mouth brushed over hers in a slow, claiming kiss. His hand slid down to the small of her back, pulling her hips against his. You're mine, Sandy, he whispered against her lips. And I don't care how this started. You're not walking away from me now. Sandy's tears slipped down her cheeks as Mark kissed her again, deeper this time, his tongue sliding against hers as his hands gripped her waist like he was scared she might disappear. When he pulled back, his breath was heavy, his eyes dark with dangerous heat. Don't run from this, he murmured. Sandy's heart slammed painfully against her ribs. And what if I'm already in too deep? Mark's mouth curved into a dark smile. Then stop pretending this isn't real, he growled. He lifted her off the ground and carried her toward the bedroom, his mouth brushing over her ear as he whispered, Stop fighting it, Sandy. Stop fighting me? Sandy's breath trembled as Mark laid her down on the bed, his large body hovering over hers. His hand slid beneath the silk of her dress, his mouth descending on hers with a hunger that left her breathless. I'm not letting you go, Mark whispered darkly. Ever. Sandy's hands curled into the sheets as Mark's mouth trailed down her neck, his hand sliding between her thighs. When his mouth brushed against her bare skin, her back arched as a soft moan slipped from her lips. Mark's gaze darkened with dangerous obsession. Mine, he growled. You've always been mine, Sandy. And now I'm going to make sure you never forget it. Sandy's breath trembled as Mark's mouth descended on her again, his hands sliding beneath her dress as he claimed her completely. And this time there was no confusion about what was happening between them. This wasn't about a contract anymore. This was possession. This was love. And there was no turning back. The weekend began with Mark's private jet touching down on a secluded tropical island where the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and amber. Sandy stood at the edge of the villa's sprawling balcony, the salty breeze brushing against her smooth brown skin as her eyes scanned the endless ocean stretching out toward the horizon. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below filled the air, but it was the sound of Mark's deep, steady breath behind her that made her heart pound. Do you like it? His voice came from behind, low and rough. Sandy turned, finding Mark standing shirtless, his chiseled chest and defined abs bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his beard framing his sharp jawline in a way that made him look even more devastatingly handsome. Sandy's breath caught when his eyes darkened, a storm of possession and desire swirling beneath the icy blue. He moved toward her, his bare feet soundless against the marble floor, until his hands settled on her waist. His thumb brushed slow circles over the thin silk of her dress, making her skin tingle. It's beautiful, Sandy whispered, her voice barely audible over the crash of the waves. You're beautiful, Mark countered, his mouth brushing against the curve of her neck. His hands slid down to her hips, his thumbs pressing firmly against her bare skin beneath the dress. Sandy's breath hitched when he lifted her effortlessly, setting her down on the balcony's marble railing. You didn't answer my question, Mark said darkly, his lips brushing against her ear as his hands gripped her thighs. Sandy's eyes fluttered closed as his mouth trailed down her neck, his beard scraping deliciously against her sensitive skin. I said it's beautiful, she whispered. Mark's hand tightened around her thigh, his mouth curving into a dark smile against her neck. I wasn't asking about the view, he murmured, his tongue flicking against the sensitive spot just below her ear. Sandy's hands curled around his shoulders, her nails digging into his bare skin. Mark. Her voice trembled when his mouth descended over her collarbone. Come with me, Mark whispered. Sandy opened her eyes to find his intense gaze burning into her. His pupils were blown wide with hunger, his jaw tightening as his hands slid beneath the hem of her dress. Without waiting for an answer, Mark scooped her into his arms, carrying her down a winding stone path toward the villa's private pool. The water shimmered under the moonlight, steam rising from the surface in delicate tendrils. Mark set her down at the edge of the pool, his hands sliding down to the hem of her dress. Take it off, he demanded, his voice sharp with need. Sandy's breath faltered as Mark pulled the thin straps of her dress down her shoulders, letting the silk slip down her body and pool at her feet. His eyes darkened as his gaze swept over her bare skin, lingering on her smooth curves and the way the moonlight kissed her brown skin. Mark's hand slid over her hip, pulling her against his chest. His mouth brushed over hers as his hands slid down to cup her backside. You're driving me insane, he growled against her lips. I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting you. Sandy's hands slid up his chest, her fingers brushing over the hard muscles of his abdomen as he pulled her into the pool. The heated water closed over their bodies, and Sandy gasped when Mark pinned her against the smooth stone wall. His mouth crashed against hers, his tongue sweeping between her lips with a desperate intensity. His hands slid over her wet skin, cupping her waist as he pressed his body flush against hers. Sandy's fingers curled into his hair as Mark's mouth trailed down her neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin beneath her ear. I don't want you for one night, Mark growled, his breath ragged as his lips brushed over her wet shoulder. I want you forever. Sandy's heart stopped as Mark's hand slid beneath the water, his fingers tracing the curve of her thigh. Mark, she whispered, her hands tightening around his shoulders. He lifted her, pressing her back against the edge of the pool as his mouth descended over her chest. Sandy's breath broke when Mark's lips claimed her breast, his tongue flicking over the sensitive peak as his hands gripped her hips with bruising strength. Mine, he growled darkly, his breath hot against her skin. You belong to me, Sandy. Don't even think about running. Sandy's hands tightened around his neck as Mark's mouth claimed hers again, his tongue sliding between her lips with dangerous intensity. He lifted her from the pool and carried her toward the villa, his hands gripping her bare thighs as her wet skin pressed against his hard chest. Mark laid her down on the massive bed, his body covering hers as his mouth devoured hers in a deep, hungry kiss. Tell me you want this, Mark demanded, his breath ragged as his hand slid down her waist. Sandy's eyes filled with tears as her hands framed his face. I want you, she whispered. I want you, Mark. His eyes flashed with dark triumph as his mouth descended over hers again. Sandy's breath broke when his hand slid between her thighs, his fingers parting her as his mouth trailed down her neck. Mark's breath trembled when he pushed inside her, his hands gripping her hips as her body arched beneath him. Sandy, he growled, his mouth pressing against her shoulder. You feel so perfect. Sandy's hands slid over his back as Mark's pace quickened, his breath ragged as his body moved over hers with desperate intensity. His hands framed her face, his eyes burning into hers as his mouth claimed hers in a bruising kiss. You're mine, Mark growled. Forever. Sandy's breath broke as her body tightened around him, her head falling back as Mark's name escaped her lips. Mark's mouth brushed over her jaw as his hands tightened around her hips, his body trembling with release as he buried himself deep inside her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Mark's breath was heavy against her ear as his hands slid up to cup her face. You belong to me, he whispered, his lips brushing over her temple. Don't ever forget that. Sandy's eyes filled with tears as her hands framed his face. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered. Mark's gaze darkened with dangerous satisfaction. His mouth curved into a dark smile as his hands slid down her waist. Good, he whispered. His mouth brushed over hers in a slow, possessive kiss as his hands tightened around her hips. "Because I'm not letting you go." Sandy's breath caught when Mark pulled her beneath him, his mouth descending over hers as his hands slid beneath her thighs. "You drive me crazy, Sandy," he growled, his mouth trailing down her neck. "And now that I've got you, I'm never letting you go." It started with a strange heaviness in her limbs, a deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could erase. Sandy sat curled on the plush leather sofa in Mark's penthouse, her hand resting against her forehead as a wave of dizziness washed over her. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to steady her breath, but her heart raced erratically beneath her ribcage. "Sandy?" Mark's voice cut through the fog. She opened her eyes to find him standing at the edge of the room, his sharp blue gaze narrowed with concern. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt in front of her, his large hands wrapping around her trembling ones. "What's wrong?" Sandy shook her head. I don't know, I just feel off." Mark's jaw tightened. His hand rose to her forehead, brushing back the damp curls sticking to her skin. "You're burning up," he muttered darkly. "We're going to the doctor." "It's nothing," Sandy protested weakly, but Mark's gaze darkened with that dangerous intensity she had come to know so well. "It's not nothing," he growled. Without giving her a chance to argue, he scooped her into his arms, holding her close to his chest as he carried her toward the elevator. "Mark!" "Don't argue." Mark's voice was hard, leaving no room for negotiation. He carried her down to his private car, his grip possessive and steady. Sandy's head rested against his chest as the deep hum of the engine filled the air. Mark's hand slid over her thigh, his thumb brushing slow, soothing circles over her bare skin. His jaw was tight, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, but Sandy could feel the tension radiating from his body. When they arrived at the private medical facility, Mark didn't wait for the staff to assist him. He carried Sandy through the doors and straight to the examination room, barking orders at the staff until the doctor arrived. Sandy sat on the examination table, feeling the cool metal beneath her thighs, as Mark stood close, his hand gripping hers tightly. "What's wrong with her?" Mark's voice was sharp and dangerous as the doctor examined her. "Mr. Wood," the doctor said calmly, "we'll run some tests. Please give us a moment." "No." Mark's grip tightened around Sandy's hand. "I'm staying." The doctor hesitated, but Mark's piercing glare left no room for argument. They drew blood and ran a series of tests while Mark stood by Sandy's side, his thumb stroking over the back of her hand. Sandy's head spun, and a deep sense of unease twisted in her stomach as the minutes stretched into an unbearable silence. Finally, the doctor returned, holding a folder of papers. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Miss Brown?" Sandy's heart hammered against her chest. Mark's hand tightened around hers. "What is it?" Mark's voice was lethal, dangerous. The doctor's gaze flicked between them before he smiled slightly. "Congratulations, you're pregnant." Sandy's breath vanished. Her mouth parted, but no sound came out. Pregnant. The word echoed in her mind, a deafening rush of emotion crashing over her. Her eyes widened as her hand drifted instinctively to her stomach. Pregnant. How was that possible? Of course, she knew how, but still, she had never expected. Her throat tightened. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." "It's very possible," the doctor said gently. "You're about 6 weeks along." Sandy's vision blurred. Her heart raced painfully as her hand pressed against her flat stomach. Mark's grip on her hand turned to steel. "Leave us." Mark's voice was sharp and cold. The doctor hesitated. "Mr. Wood, now." The doctor nodded and left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Sandy's breath trembled as her gaze lifted to Mark's face. He stood frozen, his expression carved from stone. His blue eyes were dark and stormy, swirling with something dangerous and raw. Pregnant? Mark's voice was barely a whisper, but it struck Sandy harder than a shout. She nodded, her throat thick with emotion. I didn't know. Mark's gaze dropped to her stomach. His hand lifted and hesitated for a breathless moment before pressing gently against her abdomen. Sandy's breath caught. Mark's hand was large and warm as it settled over the small swell of her belly. His fingers splayed wide, his thumb brushing slow circles over the soft fabric of her dress. Slowly, his gaze lifted to hers. "You're carrying my baby." His voice was rough and low, his eyes dark with an emotion Sandy couldn't quite name. "Yes," Sandy's voice broke. Mark's eyes flashed. His hand tightened over her stomach. Then, suddenly, he pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. Sandy gasped as Mark's mouth pressed against the top of her head, his hand sliding to the back of her neck. "You're not leaving me now." Mark's voice was low and dangerous, vibrating against her skin. "We're a family now." Sandy stiffened. "Mark, His hand slid to her jaw, tilting her face up until their eyes locked. His gaze burned into hers, fierce and unyielding. "You're mine," Mark growled. "You and the baby." Sandy's heart raced wildly beneath her ribcage, her hands curled against his chest as his thumb brushed over her lower lip. "This was supposed to be a deal," Sandy whispered. Mark's mouth twisted into a dark smile. "It stopped being a deal the moment I touched you," he said darkly. His hand slid down to her belly again, possessively splaying over the soft curve beneath her dress. "And now that you're carrying my baby, you're not going anywhere." Sandy's breath trembled as Mark's mouth brushed over hers, his lips soft but commanding. His hand slipped behind her neck, holding her still as his tongue slid between her lips in a deep, claiming kiss. Sandy's knees weakened as Mark's mouth consumed hers, his breath ragged as his hand slid over her stomach again. "Mine," Mark whispered against her lips. "Forever." Tears burned in Sandy's eyes as her hands curled into his shirt. "Mark." He pulled back just enough to meet her gaze, his eyes dark with fierce protectiveness. "I don't care how this started," Mark said, his voice rough and sure. "All that matters now is that you're carrying my child, and I will protect you both, no matter what." Sandy's heart slammed painfully against her ribs. Mark's gaze softened just slightly as his hand slid over her belly. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Sandy's tears slipped free as Mark's mouth brushed over her forehead, his hands holding her close. She hadn't realized how deeply she had longed to hear those words until now. "I'm scared," Sandy whispered. Mark's hand slid to the back of her head, his lips pressing against her temple. "Don't be," he said darkly. "I'll take care of you, both of you." Sandy's breath hitched as Mark's hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing over her cheeks. "You belong to me," he growled. "And now that you're carrying my child, I'm never letting you go." Sandy's lips parted, but before she could speak, Mark's mouth covered hers in a deep, consuming kiss. Her heart thundered as Mark's arms tightened around her, his breath harsh against her mouth. When he pulled back, his gaze was fierce and unrelenting. "You're mine," Mark said again, his hand sliding over her stomach. "You and the baby." Sandy's breath trembled as Mark's mouth pressed against her forehead. Her heart raced wildly as his arms tightened around her. "Forever," Mark whispered. It was late in the evening when Sandy's phone rang, the sharp vibration slicing through the quiet of the penthouse. She frowned, setting down the glass of water in her hand as she picked up the phone. An unknown number. Her heart tightened with unease as she answered. "Hello?" There was a long, cold silence on the other end of the line before a low, menacing voice spoke. "Did you think you could get away so easily? Mark Wood may think he owns the world, but his debt isn't settled. If you don't handle it, there will be consequences." Sandy's breath hitched. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the phone. "What are you talking about?" "Mark settled the debt." "Not entirely," the voice interrupted, dark and sharp. "We still want our cut. If you don't come to us directly, we'll come to you, and we won't be gentle." The line went dead. Sandy's breath raced as she stood frozen, the phone still pressed against her ear. Her hands trembled as icy fear crawled through her veins. Mark promised that the debt was handled. He promised. But what if? What if something had gone wrong? What if Mark didn't know? Sandy's mind spiraled as fear gripped her chest. She couldn't let this fall on Mark, not when he had already done so much for her. This was her mess. She had to fix it herself. She grabbed her coat and slipped out of the penthouse before Mark could notice. Her heels clicked hurriedly down the marble floor as she caught a cab, her heart thundering as she gave the address the caller had mentioned. The drive felt endless, each second stretching into eternity as the city lights blurred past the windows. Sandy's hands were cold, her pulse erratic as the cab pulled up to a dark warehouse on the edge of the city. She hesitated at the door, her breath hitching as she pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, the stale air thick with the scent of smoke and metal. A group of men stood near the back, their eyes sharp and cold as they watched her approach. "I'm here," Sandy said, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. "Tell me what you want." The tallest man stepped forward, his smile cold and predatory. "It's simple," he said, his gaze sweeping over her. "Your boyfriend owes us, and if he doesn't pay, you'll pay the price." "Mark doesn't owe you anything," Sandy snapped. "You're lying." The man's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you calling me a liar?" He stepped closer, his hand brushing her arm. Sandy flinched, her heart pounding wildly as fear coiled in her stomach. "Don't touch me." "Or what?" the man sneered. "You think Mark Wood is going to save you. He's not here now, sweetheart." Sandy's chest tightened painfully. She stepped back toward the door, but the man's hand shot out, gripping her arm. Sandy twisted, trying to pull free, but his grip was like iron. "Let me go," she screamed. Suddenly, the door behind them burst open. "Get your hands off her." Mark's voice was lethal, his rage vibrating through the air like a whip. The man's grip loosened just enough for Sandy to stumble free. Mark stormed across the room, his blue eyes burning with dark fury as he grabbed the man by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "You don't touch her," Mark growled, his hand tightening until the man's face turned red. "Do you understand me?" Mark. "You come near her again and I will destroy you," Mark hissed. He let the man go, sending him crashing to the floor. Then he turned toward Sandy, his chest heaving. His gaze swept over her from head to toe, searching for injuries. "Are you hurt?" Sandy's breath was still ragged. I'm fine." "No, you're not." Mark's voice was hard as he wrapped his arms around her, his hands sliding to the back of her head. His body was shaking beneath his tailored suit as his lips pressed against her hair. "You scared the hell out of me," he whispered roughly. "Don't you ever do that again." Sandy sagged against him, her breath hitching. "I didn't want to burden you." "Burden me?" Mark pulled back, his gaze fierce and dark. "You are never a burden, Sandy. You are everything." Sandy's throat tightened. "I thought..." "No." Mark's hand slid to her jaw, tilting her face up toward his. "There is no I in this anymore, Sandy. You and me, we're a team. You don't carry things alone anymore." A tear slipped down Sandy's cheek. "I was scared." Mark's gaze softened just enough to show the raw emotion burning beneath his fury. "I was terrified," he said hoarsely. "When I got that call, when I thought something might have happened to you, I nearly lost my mind." Sandy's heart squeezed painfully. "Mark." Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires outside broke the moment. Sandy's eyes widened as Mark pulled her protectively against his chest. The door flew open, and another man burst in, a gun flashing beneath his coat. "Mark!" Sandy screamed. Mark's hand shot out, shoving her behind him. "Stay down!" He moved toward the intruder, his body tense and lethal as the man raised the gun. Mark lunged, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting until the gun dropped to the floor with a loud clatter. He slammed the man against the wall, his hand locking around his throat. "You thought you could threaten her?" Mark's voice was pure steel. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" The man choked, struggling beneath Mark's grip. Please," Mark's eyes narrowed. "Touch her again and you won't be breathing next time." He let the man fall to the ground, gasping for breath. Mark turned towards Sandy, his chest heaving as adrenaline burned in his veins. Sandy's breath hitched as he rushed toward her, his hands sliding over her arms. "Are you hurt?" "No," Sandy whispered, her eyes wide. "Mark." His arms closed around her, his breath ragged against her ear. "You're coming home with me. Now." Sandy nodded shakily. Mark wrapped his jacket around her shoulders and guided her toward the door. His hand never left her as he pulled her into the waiting car. Mark sat beside her, his arm coiled around her protectively as the city blurred past them. "Don't scare me like that again," Mark whispered. Sandy's breath hitched as Mark's hand slid over her stomach. "I can't lose you. Or the baby." Sandy's heart squeezed painfully. "Mark." "Shh." Mark's hand curled beneath her jaw as his lips brushed over hers. His kiss was desperate and deep, his breath trembling as he pulled back. "You belong to me now," he whispered darkly, "and I will destroy anyone who tries to take you away from me." Sandy's heart thundered as Mark's arms tightened around her. For the first time in her life, she felt safe, and completely his. The evening was perfect, a crisp breeze drifting through the cool night air as Sandy stepped onto the rooftop terrace of Mark's penthouse, her heart fluttering at the sight before her. Hundreds of candles flickered softly against the darkening sky, their golden glow casting a dreamy haze over the white silk-draped table in the center of the terrace. Delicate rose petals, soft shades of red and white, were scattered across the floor, leading toward the table where crystal glasses of champagne reflected the candlelight. Soft, romantic music floated through the air, the quiet strum of strings wrapping around her senses like a warm embrace. Sandy's breath hitched as Mark stepped forward, his tailored black suit fitting his broad frame perfectly, his piercing blue eyes fixed solely on her. Her heart raced wildly as he took her hand, his fingers threading through hers with possessive warmth. "You look beautiful," Mark murmured, his gaze darkening as his thumb brushed the back of her hand. Sandy's chest tightened. She was wearing a deep red satin dress that clung to her curves, her braided hair cascading over one shoulder in soft waves. "Mark, this is incredible," she whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "You didn't have to do all of this." Mark's hand tightened around hers as his gaze sharpened. "Yes, I did." His voice was low, intense. He guided her toward the table, pulling out a chair for her, but instead of sitting across from her, he knelt in front of her, his hand still wrapped around hers. Sandy's breath stalled as her eyes widened. "Mark?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. Sandy's heart hammered painfully against her ribs as he opened it, revealing the most beautiful diamond ring she had ever seen. A large, flawless oval diamond sparkled in the moonlight, set against a delicate band encrusted with smaller diamonds. The light refracted through the stone, making it shimmer like stars against the night sky. Sandy's lips parted in shock, her heart thundering so loudly it drowned out everything else. "Mark." Her voice trembled. Mark's gaze burned into her as he took a shaky breath, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. His eyes were fierce, vulnerable beneath the hardened surface of his usual control. Forget the contract, Mark said, his voice rough and low. Forget how this started. I don't care about the deal anymore. I don't care about the reasons we came together. All I know is that I love you, Sandy. Sandy's breath hitched as tears pooled in her eyes. Mark. His jaw tightened as his gaze softened with rare vulnerability. From the moment I touched you, everything changed. I thought this was going to be business, just another cold transaction. But you shattered every wall I had. You've become the air I breathe, the only thing I think about when I wake up, the last thing I see before I fall asleep. You've made me a better man, and now I can't imagine my life without you. Sandy's throat tightened painfully as tears slipped down her cheeks. Mark's hand shook slightly as he held up the ring. Marry me, Sandy, he whispered, his voice breaking. Not because of the contract, not because of the deal, but because I love you more than I've ever loved anyone in my life. Marry me because I can't breathe without you, because you and this baby are my entire world now. Sandy's hands flew to her mouth as her breath trembled. Her heart pounded wildly as her vision blurred with tears. Mark's expression was raw, completely open in a way that made her chest ache. He was giving her everything, laying his heart bare without hesitation. I know I can't promise that things will always be easy, Mark continued, his gaze never leaving hers. But I swear to you, I will love you with everything I have. I will protect you. I will protect our child. I will spend every day making you feel like the most precious thing in the world, because you are. Sandy's hands shook as she lowered them, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. Mark, please, he whispered, his blue eyes dark with longing and need. Be my wife, Sandy. A single tear slipped down Sandy's cheek as her chest ached from the weight of her emotions. Her lips trembled as she nodded. Yes, she whispered, her voice cracking. Yes, Mark, I'll marry you. Mark's eyes darkened with fierce joy as relief swept through his features. He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands steady despite the emotion rippling through him. As soon as the ring was secure, Mark surged upward and pulled her into his arms, crushing his mouth against hers. Sandy gasped as his arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground as his lips devoured hers with raw desperation. His breath was hot and ragged as he kissed her deeply, possessively, his hand sliding into her hair as his body pressed firmly against hers. Mine, Mark whispered darkly against her lips. Forever. Sandy's hands slid over his chest, her heart soaring as she kissed him back just as fiercely. Her fingers curled into the back of his jacket as tears slipped down her cheeks, mingling with the taste of his kiss. Forever, she breathed. Mark's arms tightened around her as his mouth brushed over her jaw, down her neck, leaving a trail of heat and longing in his wake. You're not getting away from me now, Mark growled. Sandy's heart fluttered as Mark pulled back, just enough to press his forehead against hers. His gaze was dark and intense, burning with love and obsession. I'm never letting you go, he murmured. Never. Sandy smiled through her tears as her hand slid over his chest, her fingers resting over the rapid beat of his heart. I don't want you to. Mark's mouth curled into a dangerous smile as he kissed her again, his breath hot and desperate. Good. He kissed her again, deeper this time, his hand sliding down her back as he held her possessively against him. Sandy's breath trembled as Mark kissed her temple, his lips brushing over her skin like a sacred vow. I love you, he whispered, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it. Sandy's heart swelled painfully as her arms wrapped around his neck. I love you too. Mark pulled back just enough to meet her gaze. His eyes were dark and full of promise. Come with me, he murmured. Where? Sandy whispered. To bed, Mark growled. You just agreed to marry me. Now I need to remind you exactly what that means. Sandy's cheeks flushed as Mark scooped her into his arms and carried her toward the penthouse doors. Her heart pounded as Mark's lips brushed over her ear. "You're mine, Sandy, and tonight I'm going to make sure you never forget it." Sandy's breath caught as Mark carried her inside, the city lights fading behind them. And as Mark's mouth claimed hers again, she knew, with absolute certainty, that this was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. The night was thick with tension, the sterile white walls of the hospital room vibrating with the low hum of medical equipment. Sandy lay in the hospital bed, her face pale and glistening with sweat, her hands gripping the sheets so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead, and her brown skin glowed under the dim lights as another wave of pain ripped through her body. She gasped, her back arching slightly as she squeezed Mark's hand with everything she had. "Mark," she whimpered, her voice strained and raw from hours of labor. Mark's heart twisted painfully at the sound of her voice. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed, his large hands enveloping hers as his thumb stroked over her trembling fingers. His blue eyes were dark with panic, but he forced himself to stay calm for her sake. "I'm right here, baby," he whispered, leaning down to brush his lips against her damp forehead. His hand slid through her tangled hair, his other hand clutching hers tightly. "Breathe, Sandy. Just breathe for me." Sandy's eyes fluttered open, glazed with tears and exhaustion. "I can't, Mark. I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It hurts. Oh God, it hurts." A raw sound escaped Mark's throat as he leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "Yes, you can," he said fiercely. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known. You can do this. Just a little more, baby. I'm right here." Sandy screamed as another contraction hit, her body trembling violently beneath the thin hospital gown. Mark's heart hammered wildly in his chest as he watched her struggle. He felt utterly helpless, but he couldn't let her see that. His hands tightened around hers, his lips brushing over her temple as he whispered, "I love you, Sandy. I love you so much. You're not alone. I'm not going anywhere." A nurse's voice echoed through the haze of pain. "She's fully dilated. It's time to push." Mark's pulse skyrocketed as the doctor moved into position. Sandy's breathing was ragged, tears streaming down her cheeks as she shook her head. Mark, I can't," she gasped, her fingers clawing into his wrist. Mark bent down, his mouth brushing over her ear. "Yes, you can," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You've come this far. I know you can do this. Just look at me. Focus on me." Sandy's eyes met his, wide and terrified, but the moment she saw the fierce devotion in his gaze, something inside her steadied. "Okay," she whispered shakily. "Okay." "Push," the doctor instructed. Sandy cried out as she bore down, her face twisting in agony. Mark's hand clenched hers as he kissed her temple. "That's it, baby. So strong. I'm so proud of you." Sandy's scream echoed through the room, followed by a sudden deafening silence. And then, a sharp, thin cry pierced the air. Sandy's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling rapidly as her eyes widened in disbelief. Mark's heart stopped completely. And then the doctor was lifting a small, wriggling body, and the sound of their baby's cries filled the room. "It's a boy," the doctor announced. Sandy's hand flew to her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. Mark's entire body tensed as the nurse carefully wrapped the baby in a soft white blanket and handed him toward Mark. Mark's breath stilled as he reached out with shaking hands, his arms curled protectively around the fragile newborn, and when he looked down at the tiny face nestled in the blanket, his throat tightened painfully. He had sandy brown hair, a soft pink face, and when his eyes fluttered open, dark, piercing blue eyes stared back at him. Mark's breath hitched. His chest tightened as he whispered, "Oh my God." The baby's small hand curled around Mark's finger, and something inside Mark shattered completely. He bent his head, pressing his lips to the baby's forehead as his shoulders shook. "He's perfect," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. He turned toward Sandy, tears glistening in his eyes as he carefully lowered the baby into her waiting arms. Sandy's face crumpled as the baby's tiny body settled against her chest. "Hi, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her fingers brushed over his soft cheek as tears spilled down her face. "You're so beautiful." Mark slid onto the bed beside her, his arm wrapping protectively around her shoulders as he pressed a lingering kiss to her temple. Sandy's eyes met his, dark and glistening with emotion. "Mark," she whispered, "we made him." Mark's throat tightened painfully. He leaned down, his lips brushing over her damp forehead. "You gave me more than a son," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You gave me a reason to love." Sandy's breath caught as Mark's hand slid over the back of her head, his fingers threading through her hair as he leaned down and kissed her deeply. His lips trembled against hers, pouring every ounce of love he felt into the kiss. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers as their son's soft cries settled between them. "I love you," Mark whispered. "I love you so much, Sandy." Sandy smiled weakly, her free hand sliding over his chest. "I love you too," she whispered. Mark's hand moved down to rest against Sandy's swollen belly. "You've given me everything," he whispered. "A son, a family, a reason to breathe." Sandy's eyes filled with tears as Mark pressed another kiss to her temple. He gently lifted their baby from her arms, holding him close as the baby's tiny hand curled around his finger. Mark's heart clenched painfully. He never thought he could love anything this much. But this little life, this woman beside him, they were his whole world now. "We're a family," Mark whispered, "forever." Sandy's hand curled over his, her head resting against his shoulder. Mark's gaze darkened as he stared down at his son, his jaw tightening with fierce protectiveness. "No one is ever going to hurt you," he whispered to the baby. "You're mine, just like your mother." Sandy's breath hitched as Mark kissed the baby's forehead, his lips lingering there for a long moment before he settled back against the pillows with Sandy nestled beside him. The weight of their son in his arms made Mark's chest feel too tight, too full, but it was the best kind of feeling. He had everything he'd ever wanted. And as Sandy drifted off to sleep against his shoulder, Mark's arms tightened protectively around his family. His heart was no longer empty. It was overflowing. And for the first time in his life, Mark knew what it meant to truly love. The golden afternoon light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their sprawling mansion, casting a soft, hazy glow over the polished hardwood floors. Outside, the manicured lawn stretched endlessly toward the horizon, the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs, adding a soothing rhythm to the air. Inside the luxurious living room, Mark sat cross-legged on the floor, dressed casually in a white t-shirt and gray sweatpants, his tousled dark hair falling boyishly over his forehead as he leaned forward with an easy smile. In front of him sat their baby boy, chubby cheeks flushed pink, his bright blue eyes wide with fascination as Mark held up a plush bear and made it dance. "Look at this," Mark murmured, his deep voice low and affectionate as he waved the toy toward his son. The baby gurgled happily, his tiny hands reaching out and clutching at the bear's soft fur. Mark's mouth curled into a slow smile, his heart expanding painfully at the sight of his son's wide, joyful expression. His hand gently brushed over the baby's soft brown curls, his thumb lingering against the baby's cheek as the little boy cooed. Mark's gaze softened, his chest tightening with an emotion so deep it nearly took his breath away. Just a few feet away, Sandy sat on the cream-colored couch, wearing a simple off-the-shoulder sweater and a pair of soft leggings, her long dark hair neatly braided over one shoulder. Her smooth brown skin glowed in the afternoon light, and her full lips curled into a warm smile as she watched Mark and their baby. Her heart swelled at the sight of them together. The man she had once thought of as cold and unreachable now looked completely at home with their son in his arms. Mark looked up suddenly, and when his eyes met Sandy's, a slow, molten heat ignited in his gaze. "Come here," he murmured, his voice low and husky. Sandy's smile widened, a soft flush warming her cheeks. "I'm comfortable right here," she teased. Mark's smile darkened. "That wasn't a request, sweetheart," he said with quiet authority. Sandy's eyes sparkled with mischief as she slowly rose from the couch. Mark's eyes followed her every step, his gaze dark and possessive as she walked toward him. When she stopped in front of him, Mark reached out, his large hands circling her waist as he tugged her down onto his lap with effortless strength. Sandy laughed, the sound soft and breathless as her arms curled around his neck. "Mark," she whispered, her eyes shining as his hand slid beneath the hem of her sweater, his palm resting warm and firm against the small of her back. Mark's other hand curled around the back of her neck, drawing her closer until their faces were only inches apart. His lips brushed her ear as he whispered, "You saved me, Sandy." Sandy's breath hitched. Her fingers slid into the soft curls at the nape of his neck as her heart pounded violently against her ribs. "Mark." His hand tightened on her back, his lips grazing the curve of her jaw as his voice dropped into a dark, dangerous whisper. "You think I don't know how lost I was before you?" he murmured. "I was cold, empty, dead inside. And then you walked into my life and shattered every wall I built. You gave me a reason to feel again, a reason to breathe. You gave me a son." His eyes burned as his gaze flicked to the baby, still sitting on the floor, then back to her. "You gave me everything." Sandy's chest ached, tears gathering in her eyes as her fingers curled tighter in his hair. "I didn't save you, Mark," she whispered. "You saved me." Mark's jaw tightened, his throat working as his hand slid higher beneath her sweater, his thumb tracing slow, hypnotic circles against her spine. "No," he said fiercely. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me. And now I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know exactly how much I love you." Sandy's breath hitched painfully as Mark's mouth brushed over hers, lightly at first, just a whisper of contact before he deepened the kiss. His hand slid into her hair, tilting her head as his tongue swept past her lips, claiming her in a way that made her toes curl. Sandy melted into him, her body arching into his as a soft moan escaped her throat. When Mark finally pulled back, his breath was ragged, his forehead pressed against hers. "Forever," he whispered. Sandy's hands slid down his chest, feeling the steady, pounding beat of his heart beneath her palms. "Forever," she whispered back. Mark's lips curled into a slow, wicked smile before he kissed her again, this time softer, gentler, as if savoring her. When he pulled back, he turned toward their baby, who was still watching them with wide, fascinated eyes. Mark reached out, scooping the baby into his arms and settling him comfortably against his chest. The baby yawned, his tiny hand curling into Mark's shirt. Mark's eyes softened, his large hand cupping the back of his son's head as he turned toward Sandy with a look of pure devotion. "He's perfect," Mark whispered. Sandy's heart throbbed painfully as she leaned into Mark's side, resting her head against his shoulder. "Just like his father," she whispered. Mark's eyes darkened, a slow smile spreading across his face. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "He's perfect because of you." Sandy smiled as Mark's arm curled protectively around her shoulders, his hand sliding down her arm until their fingers intertwined. His thumb brushed over the gold wedding band on her finger, a subtle reminder of the vows they had exchanged not so long ago. "I love you," Sandy whispered, her eyes soft. Mark's eyes darkened as he leaned down, brushing his lips over her temple. "I love you more," he said softly. Sandy closed her eyes, feeling Mark's steady heartbeat beneath her cheek as their baby drifted to sleep between them. The sun slipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the room as the quiet sound of waves echoed through the open windows. Sandy's heart swelled with happiness, knowing that this quiet, perfect moment was exactly what she had always dreamed of. And as Mark's hand slid over hers, his thumb brushing over her wedding band, Sandy knew deep down that this love, this family, was not the result of a contract. It was destiny.